still coming in? I don't think this mic is live.
We have a mic that's not live. Is there? What?
Test. All right, that's working.
Great. Thank you.
Is my mic live?
I'm okay.
I don't think they can hear me.
Before we get started, this is a big panel. We cover a lot of ground, and what we found last year is that doing a separate Q&A section slends it to an untenable extent. So our compromise is that we're going to do questions via Twitter. If you have a smartphone that has Twitter on it, you can do this. Yeah, look around to your neighbors. If you don't, find someone who does. Tweet questions during the panel. This is my Twitter address. I will be checking it periodically. The reception in here is pretty okay. We'll see if it's really not working midway through. We can try something else. But it seems to be doing okay so far. And then that way we can follow and incorporate questions as as they relate to the span of topics. So let's see what time it is. Let me give it like another minute, or go ahead and start.
Do you have one?
Actually, the doors are closed. Let's start. So this is brief history. This is looking past the target audience. This is a panel that started a year ago at Emerald City Comic Con because a lot of us were really fed up with the lack of of panels and programming covering intersectional diversity. And because there'd just been one of those conversations where someone, not related to Emerald City, they're great about they're great about actually actively seeking diversity, but someone at some convention had made the excuse that, well, their panels were all straight white dudes because they just really couldn't find enough people who were interested and qualified. And as sort of a both middle fingers raised riding off into the sunset, I decided to see if I could put together a panel that that did not involve that was majority women, majority non-white, had heavy and had really just heavy cross-representation of qualified professionals who were awesome, who were established as speakers in under an hour. And the first iteration of this was the result. It was fantastic. We have some folks returning from that. Then we did it again. We decided to continue it on Tumblr. We did it again at Stumptown Comics Fest last year with a slightly different lineup. This one is kind of a fusion plus one new person. Looking past the target audience isn't diversity 101. If you are here to find out why it matters that geek culture be diverse, that's something that we're taking as a given going in. And with that in mind, let's go down and introduce. I'm Rachel Edidin. I'm a writer and editor, formerly of Dark Horse Comics, now largely freelance. I cover comics and arts and culture for Wired.com. And I write a lot about gender and identity politics in geek culture.
Hi, my name is Regina Buenobra. I'm the North American Community Team Lead at ArenaNet. I work on ArenaNet works on a game called Guild Wars 2. I also helped start a feminist gamer blog called The Border House a few years ago, and that's me.
Hi, I'm Sherilyn Eaton. I'm the founder of the Orm Society, which is dedicated to promoting Black women who are working in comics and also Black female characters.
Hi, I'm Willow Wilson. I'm most recently the writer of the newly launched Ms. Marvel, also author of the World Fantasy Award-winning novel Aleph the Unseen, and various and sundry other comics, including the Eisner Award-nominated series Air and Mystic, The 10th Apprentice.
My name is Andy Corey, and I'm one of the editors of ComicsAlliance.com, and we cover a lot of things, including this subject as it relates to, I suppose you could say, mainstream geek culture, comics culture, those kinds of things.
I'm Spay Monster. I'm working on webcomics, doing queer comics. I do a comic called F-Skin. A few years ago I did a comic called Kyle and Atticus, and right now I'm currently involved doing the Beyond anthology, which is a queer sci-fi fantasy anthology that I'm co-editing with Rachel. Yes, great.
I'm Scotty Iseri. I produce a show called The Digits. It teaches kids math and will be on television in 2015.
So I want to start by talking about intersectionality and what it means to look at diversity from an intersectional angle. And so I guess,
Okay, intersectionality. So intersectionality assumes that we all live at the intersection of different identities. No one is just, straight and that's your only identity. In my case, I'm a mix of, I have a bunch of different cultural influences. I was born in the Philippines. I grew up in the United States. I'm queer, and all those. There's different types of power dynamics and struggles that I face as, as an Asian woman, as a woman, as a queer person, and not one singular type of identity can define me. Is that okay?
And I think something else you brought up that I think is really important last year is that we tend to assume that intersections involve an intersection with the assumed default or the assumed norm. That when you say someone, that when someone is described as, for example, being from a mixed race background, the default assumption tends to be that it's white and that there are intersections that aren't moderated by assumed defaults or by the majority, and those tend to be overlooked, and especially in geek culture and in geek activism, there's a lot of unilateral activism. There's a lot of this is a women's thing. There's a lot of this is the women's panel, and this is the Black creators panel, and this is this is the queer panel, and as if there aren't people who sit at those interstices.
There was actually one example of intersectionality where, you take stereotypes like girls are bad at math, but there's also the stereotype that Asians are good at math. I'm an Asian woman, what stereotype do I fit into, right?
So the first thing that comes up when we talk about diversity in our culture and media is representation of characters. We tend to start sort of from an audience angle looking at that, and I think we're, as a panel, going to start with that and work our way back to creators and the idea of paper and pixel mirrors. What does it mean to you guys to see yourselves in media? What do you look for, and what do you want, and what do you latch onto when you find it?
It's difficult because for me it really kind of depends on the age of the person. I think I have a lot of women who come to me, it's like, what can I find that will show young Black women? What can I find for my daughter? And I think when I was younger, it was very, very important to find visual representation, to have those characters like Storm and Misty Knight. But as I grew older, I don't want just a canvas. I also want to hear those stories. So it's also important for me to be able to look past that and also find creators of color and find Black women who are telling their stories and to see those stories reflected in the larger media. So I think, yes, having visual representation is so very important for young girls, but I think as you grow older, it's kind of like you need more.
For us, when we produce the show, our show has the lead character is a mixed race, a girl of mixed race, and for me, it was important that we have that visually, but not. I never wanted to do a "Why is your Christmas different than my Christmas" episode. We don't comment on it. We don't talk about. I mean, she's the only Earthling in a show full of robots and aliens and such. But the idea was that she could be brown, for lack of a better term, of indeterminate race, and we don't have to comment on it. We don't have to show it, because growing up for me, it was always, here's the Diwali episode, here's the Ramadan episode or whatever, and it was nice to have that bone thrown our way, but it feels, it's 2014. It's time to. I'm sure we've all had that diversity 101 lesson.
I look for characters that have that intersectional experience, frankly, where they aren't just, let's say, take superhero comics, for example, like Superman's a white guy from Kansas, and, Black Panther's a Black guy from Africa. Like you say, they're really delineated. And what Willow's doing in her Miss Marvel book is she has a girl who's an American, and she's Muslim, and she's Pakistani, and she's a superhero, and she depicts those tensions and advantages as well to that. Like, someone like me, I come from a mixed Middle Eastern background and American background, and I lived overseas, and I never see sort of that conflict, I suppose, for a better word. I mean, conflict's not a really good way to put it, because there shouldn't be anything wrong with all those things interacting. But if you are that sort of person, you've experienced a sort of tension that's not almost never represented in geek culture that I've seen. I mean, we have like this sort of stock half alien characters and things like that, but nothing on the level of what I think you're doing in that book right now. I think that's a big, like for mainstream stuff, a big step forward for sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
That allegory thing, I think, is a point I want to come back to, because what Spay and I are editing an anthology of queer science fiction and fantasy comics, and what this came out of was a conversation about being really frustrated with being represented primarily allegorically. And the fact that you've got there's a lot of subtextual queerness, there's a lot of subtextual or allegorical otherness in genre fiction in general, and I've done lumping superhero comics into that, but but what that means is well, I think it massively others people in a way that even, you know, the Your Christmas Isn't Like My Christmas episodes don't even quite. And it also, people grow up thinking that allegory is enough, and it's not. Like, kids need to see themselves, and adults need to see themselves too.
And they need to see themselves not as the cautionary tale. The reason that I got into Beyond with Rachel is that the queerness and transness and that being generally an allegory, as you're saying, but when it was there, it would be the cautionary tale, either warning people away from it or warning people like me that, you know, this is the life that you're going to be living, and never a telling of healthy stories or healthy relationships or characters living fulfilling lives and that sort of thing. And so that was my big deal with Beyond, that we wanted to have people moving beyond the cautionary tale.
Or the villain.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the queer villain is a really popular trope in sort of fantasy fiction and sci-fi fiction.
Even literary fiction. Look at Downton Abbey.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a trope in kids media too. There's this great paper by Meredith Lee Bulmer and Marky LaFont on the queering, the consistent queering and feminization of male villains in Disney movies. And actually,
Fancy lads.
Even female villains, because a lot of female villains are very heavily drag queen coded. And they looked at factors that were, you know, things like dialogue and the way they speak and the way they act, but also things like the way their hands were drawn relative to the hands of other men in the cartoons versus women. And it's really one of those things that reading's like noticing the arrow in the FedEx logo. It's like you don't stop. So looking at that, looking at those intersectional definitions, geek culture, this one of the things that precipitated this panel the first time was a series of articles and events and writing that started with the idiot nerd girl meme. Do you guys remember that? It was a girl who had nerd written on her hand, which was going, and she had big glasses that were probably fake. If they'd had lenses, they would have been really heavy. She was big. And there was a meme that went around. Basically, there was a meme where it was, you know, who's your favorite? My favorite superhero, X-Man, who, to be fair, is actually a superhero.
That is one.
Like those were my favorites. The ones that were obviously like, oh, you just don't know what you're talking about.
But it was like
Yeah.
you know, Batman's my favorite movie. I've never read a Batman comic, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Trying to call the girl in the picture out, or
As a fake, you know.
yeah,
I'm totally a gamer. Plays Sims.
yeah.
It's a video game, and what that drove home is that we have a real specific default definition, not only of what a geek is, but of what they look like.
Yeah.
And what their identity is and how they identify and interact with that culture. And yeah, I'd like to hear from folks on the panel their interactions with that individually, and also some challenges to that, because I think there have been a lot lately, and a lot since the first time we did this.
On some level, I feel like there's some growing pains with the geek community in general, and that geek culture is now mainstream culture, right? The number one movie every summer is usually a comic book movie. We have filled an entire convention hall with amazing geeks from all over, and it's as a tribe, geeks have historically been downtrodden, pushed aside, underclass in some level, and now that they have taken now that the culture has become mainstream culture, there's some growing pains that happen there, right? So, not as an excuse for the fake nerd girl bullying, but I see that as a reaction to like, well, other people are in on our party now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a byproduct of this. I think geek culture is going through kind of an existential crisis now, because for so long, what made you a geek was generally defined by your interests in things that were fringe, and they are no longer that, as we can see from this convention and things like it. And now that those things are, everyone likes them. The people who had that sort of experience of like feeling cool about being into something that no one else was into has to share, and nobody likes that. You know, you're doing it wrong, like the nerd girl. You're playing The Sims, but you're not playing whatever. I'm not a gamer.
I think what's also difficult when you fall into maybe two minority groups is you'll have all these like little niche markets, and so it's like, well, okay, I guess I don't look like a regular geek, whatever a regular geek is supposed to, so I'm just gonna hang out with this little black geek crew. And then it's like, but you're a girl, so you don't fit in that crew. And then there are things that are said maybe on those message boards or where those guys hang out, and you're like, well, I'm kind of offended by this, and it makes me feel like I don't belong because I'm a woman, but this is supposed to be the place where I'm supposed to be because I'm the black geek. So it's just really frustrating when you fall into different groups and those groups kind of cut you out because of certain parts of you.
There's something like that one of our Comics Alliance writers, Andrew Wheeler, wrote about today, where he watched the short film that comes with the Thor 2 DVD, and it's about the Mandarin, and there's going to be spoilers for this short film. You're going to have to deal
I'm
with it.
leaving.
The Mandarin's in jail, and there are a bunch of not a bunch, there's two very like obvious, like when men go to jail, they become gay, sort of jokes. And Wheeler observed that over 8 or 9 movies, whatever they've done, 15 episodes of television, this is the only expression of an LGBT sort of concept in the entire Marvel Studios sort of line. And he's like, how am I supposed to feel about this? Like, I'm trying to I'm a geek, I love these characters, I love these things, and the first time that I see anything close to my sexuality represented in these things, it's this like 80s joke, this sort of like prison, the quote prison bitch joke, you know? And it was kind of heartbreaking to read, you know? But that's kind of what you said, like he's part of this group, and then it just slammed right into his group.
I think even when people feel they are on the fringe, that they're looking into the middle from the outside, there still remain groups that it's okay to other, even in that circumstance. Like it does not necessarily engender compassion for everybody. You know, I think you brought up a good example of, you know, like I'd never heard of the coding of the female, you know, I immediately thought of Maleficent when you were talking about how even female villains have this kind of look to them. And I think it's true, because subconsciously we think that even if, you know, we are a minority, there's still minorities that it's okay to make fun of. And I think LGBT people are one of them. Muslims are another one. You know, sometimes they come in kind of the same little bunch. I mean, you know, like the Mandarin, even though they go out of their way to show that, like, we don't really mean that he's a Muslim. He just hangs out in deserts with people with turbans. But we're going to put some Chinese writing on there just so you know that we're not actually mean what we say. You know, I think there's this assumption that there are certain groups in which you will find no allies, you know, and that those groups are okay to make fun of. And that's not always true. I mean, I tell people that I was a very late convert to video gaming, and now I'm like a World of Warcraft junkie. And the guy who got me into gaming was the sort of dude who would like set off every TSA alert that ever existed. You know, he like wears a topi and has like the beard down to here, and he's this huge gaming nerd. And he, you know, it's you don't know. And I think when you subconsciously assume that like, well, yes, we are on the outside and we are sort of the underdog, but it's still okay. But these people are even more on the outside, and it's still okay to make fun of them. You know, whether it's disabled people or you know, LGBT people or Muslims or whatever. And so that means that the allies that you could have had in that group feel like, well, this isn't for me. They feel more pushed to the outside, and it just sort of creates more and more space. And I think, you know, a lot of times it's done almost subconsciously. You know, like there's a need to sort of keep the people who are beneath you down because you feel that that creates more room for you to rise to the top, which is, I think, obviously
The
not
nerd
actually what it works.
hierarchy.
Yeah.
I mean, we do this, but it's different when you're doing with things like, this is the way I'm born, so I don't really like you putting me in the same old, well, the Star Trek people are above the Star Wars people. Like, yes, it's funny and I guess sort of cute when you do it with that, but when you're doing with people's identities, it hurts. You know, it's really frustrating and painful.
A brief aside to that, I'm assuming since the whole This Isn't 101, you all know this, if you ever hear someone call Big Bang Theory nerd blackface, tell them to go to hell. And then explain why. 'Cause that's like, it amazes me that's, like, I still see that. Like, people still email me about, you know, you've been writing about this thing in geek culture and it's really cool, and here's this super offensive analogy. And I was like, oh, I feel really weird about the fact that you like my writing now. But like there, and you see that in feminist communities too, and something that I keep on. I remember hanging out with women who were gamers and women who were comics fans, and it being like a super straight group, and a group that felt like because they were girls doing something that wasn't really considered feminine, they had to like make it really clear that they were super straight. And just feeling like, okay, and what that tacitly says is, yeah, is that, you know, when we talk about women in comics, we don't mean women like you.
It hurts.
Yeah. So how do you change that? How do you change the landscape of an industry and a media and also of a community? I'm gonna back this one at Scotty because I remember when you were first developing the digits and you emailed me because you were looking for storyboard artists, and you specifically mentioned that you were looking for storyboard artists of color and you were looking for women, and through watching the development process, I feel like you've really deliberately created a show that representationally but also creatively kind of isn't the target audience and isn't the default image of creators. And what's it been like going about that? Can you talk?
Well, actually, we just hit a problem. We lost 2 of our writers in the last 6 months. They left for other projects, and there were 2 of the women on the staff. So as we're looking to staff back up for the TV show, we're like, well, we can't put out an ad that says women writers wanted, but it's really important to me that we have that balance in the room. Not for any specific, you have these chromosomes, so therefore you understand this, but it's because as a woman, a writer that comes to the writer's room has the experience of being a woman that I certainly don't have, and the other 2 dudes don't have. I'm secretly Asian, so I get to hear a lot of things that white people don't think they mean. But I bring to that with an experience of being Asian and growing up Japanese, and that's not anything it's sort of inherent to who I am rather than anything that I particularly bring to the table. But for me, looking at the narrative tropes of science fiction, which is what the Digits is a sci-fi show, not wanting to do a Star Wars thing where the bad guys are sort of eerily foreign but sort of familiar because the accent sounds kind of off. It was conscious in that, like, it was I was looking to make a show that had a good balance of creative talent and, for lack of a better term, a diverse group of people to create the show. But it was kind of anti the usual sort of stabs at ethnicity. We didn't want to have like the token black guy or the token woman sort of representing in the room. We wanted to have sort of a true just sort of balance of experience in the room. And I think the result of that is a show that's very kind of irreverent on that front, because we don't broach those issues. We just pretend that they, not that we pretend that they don't exist, but we imagine a world that's beyond that, where we don't have to do the Christmas episode and we don't have to come together at the end and explain why. Oh, I thought you, yeah, oh yeah. We don't, yeah.
I think, oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think you don't have to do the Christmas episode or the let's explain why you don't treat these people this way episode when you have those people in the group to begin with. And it's normal and it's natural and all of these people are included. And I think when you're, it's really up to the community builders and the people in charge of hiring to actually go out and diversify. You know, it's hard for the fans because a lot of the times it's like, well, what can I do? You know, from my standpoint, I can't hire anyone. I can't, you know, I mean, I founded the Orm Society and that was one proactive thing I could do. But there is a limit, you know, I can't force.
I think that's why, and I just had a conversation about this on Twitter the other day, so it's fresh in my mind. We talk a lot about how important it is to have representation of minorities of various kinds on the creative side, but less about how important it is, and I'd argue equally and or more important, to have people of color and minorities on the editorial and executive side, the people who are doing the hiring, who are greenlighting the projects, who are, you know, shepherding these ideas through, because they are the gatekeepers. And you can have all the good art there is in the world. If the gatekeepers are not on board, it's not going to go anywhere. And so I think part of the conversation has to be what the makeup of the people on the other side of the table is like.
Yeah. People overwhelmingly, when they're not actively examining what they're doing, statistically, people hire people from their own backgrounds, economically, racially, in terms of gender, because I mean, humans are really tribal. We look for people like us because those are the people we connect to, those are the people we click with, those are the people we're safe around. And it's, I mean, I don't want to say it's instinctual because I feel like that's going to a whole creepy social Darwinist slope. But left to their own devices, I mean, there are a lot of really well-meaning, basically decent people perpetuating a whole lot of injustice because they're not questioning that.
So yeah, I wanted to mention like the importance of questioning things. Like at ArenaNet we have, I'm not going to say that we're the best studio in terms of diversity, but we definitely have writers and editors and creators there who are questioning things. And like half of our folks in charge of lore, like they're women. And I don't know that any, like, right now we have at least 2 canon queer relationships in the game. We have a playable race that is kind of by default pansexual. Like this doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when you have creators who are willing to, you know, push the envelope creatively and also question assumptions and like what can we do that's different and that is creative and that, you know, might speak to a different audience.
There are tangible benefits to hiring diverse contributors too. Like, I mean, I guess I'm a gatekeeper. Would you say, Rachel? I mean, I edit a website and I hire people, and I think maybe the nature of the internet might mitigate sort of the tribal hiring a little bit, because when I hire people, it's because I like what they wrote, and it's not because I looked at their Facebook, you know. So consequently, we have, you know, Cheryl and Rachel have both contributed to the site, and we have queer writers and trans writers and African Americans and you know, women. Like it's ended up being a real like boon to us. Not just people writing about their own like specific experiences. Like they're not writing the article about their Christmas. Like but coming from different experiences and backgrounds, it sort of informs you in this like quantum way of like the way you experience the world and the stuff that you want to talk about. Like if, for example, we're a comic book website, so the comic books we cover are sometimes things that I wouldn't have thought to read, but because one of my contributors is like, this is great. And it has nothing to do with, obviously, not in an obvious way, nothing to do with his or her identity as such, but it's something that they discover because of their journey. And it creates a much better, line of coverage, and it engages different kinds of audiences, and you grow, and it's good. Like, not to sound too mercenary about it, but it's actually, there's like tangible benefits to having a diverse situation.
I think it's okay to be mercenary about it.
I think one thing I want to touch on, though, just because when you say things, and it's a good thing to say that you want a diverse group so that you can have diverse experiences written about, but I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking, well, I can only write about my group, because that's not why you want diversity. The way I explained it before was kind of like your viewpoint, your culture is the filter you put on whatever you write. It's not like I'm a black woman, I'm only going to write about black women and that's it. But my experience as a black woman is going to change what I write about, and it's going to put a filter over what I write about because it's going to change my viewpoint. So yes, you can have white writers who write these wonderful books about black people, Hispanic people, but they're still going to be viewing it through the filter of their own background, whether it's Italian American, Irish American. That filter and the way that they were raised is going to color what they write. You can still have a beautiful story, but you're not going to be bringing black culture to it when you're writing about a black character. You're going to bring your own viewpoint to that character. And it can still, I mean, Bendis' Cage is amazing, but it's still a filter. I guess that's the way I see it. But don't think that you can't write this character because you're not that character's background, because we're missing out on good stories that way.
I think you said that better than I did, because the point of the different experiences, I think, is that, if we have a situation where characters are escaping an asteroid field, everything about the person that's writing that story is going to inform their take on that character. Everything from things that they have no control over, such as their race, their age, their gender, or things that they do have control over, like the education that they have or what they had for breakfast that morning. And just having a wide variety of those kinds of experiences, I think, makes for a richer storytelling experience overall. We are hiring, by the way, so if you have a resume or samples that you want to see.
A really cool kids show. Yeah, I mean, we all bring our defaults and filters, and those impact. I mean, they impact everything. They don't necessarily impact what you like, but they impact so many small, subtle ways of how you interact with the world. So my question going into this, as far as defaults and filters, is defaults, filters, and hiring. Who's doing it right? What are they doing that people can emulate? We want to see more of. What are your and if this is you or something you're doing, and I think Comics Alliance is a good example. Yeah, you should say that.
We're doing it right.
You have to pick the mic up to drop it. I have to say that I was impressed when, in the sort of the beginning of Ms. Marvel, I was writing, I was in the middle of my second novel. I hadn't written any comics in like a year or so, and I got this phone call out of the blue from Sana Amanat and Steve Wacker at Marvel, and they were like, we want to do a young female American Muslim superheroine and give her own book. And my initial thought was, are you nuts? Like, literally, that's something that I would not have pitched. I would have been like, they'd never go for it. It's not going to happen. Why bang your head against a wall? But to have, a company as large as Marvel actually seek that out and be like, yes, we actually want to do this. We want to put our money where our mouth is. I literally sat there with my jaw on the floor. Nobody could see it, thank God, because I was on the phone. But it was stunning, and I think it's a choice, and I think it's okay for it to be motivated in some sense by mercenary, objectives, because at the end of the day, you want as many people at the table as possible, because you want as many people reading your books or buying your art or watching your movies as possible, and so it is economically in your best interest to have that cast a wide net, but it's rare to actually see thinking like that. And I have to say, I was deeply impressed by that, and then I was continually impressed when there was not some sort of edict from on high. She has to look like this, she can't wear this, she has to say this, she has to not say this, that they were just sort of like, yeah, go nuts. And I'm like, for real? Really?
What I love about it is it's like I wasn't even thinking about like her religious background or her racial background. I was just like, this is so Jersey.
Good, yes. That was
You
the
know,
goal.
like, that was the first thing, like, oh, that's so Jersey. I love it. You know, like, that's like the first thing that like really came to my mind.
Because and I think that's good, because what we don't want to do is fall into this trap of having like a bunch of different model minority books, where it's like, here is the typical Black experience, here is the typical Asian experience. You know, because number one, there is no such thing. And number two, who does that help? You know, all you're doing is creating fictions to replace the fictions that already exist. And so nuance is so important, and it's a good distinction to make, for sure. And I'm glad that you thought so.
I don't know about the creator side, but on the product side, I think Archie Comics has always done a pretty good job of this.
yeah, totally.
I grew up on Archie, and it was always just sort of normalized that there were, you know, obviously they had the two Black characters that were in a relationship together, but and then they just came out with Kevin Keller a few years ago as the first gay character in Riverdale, and they've just they have, for lack of a better term, normalized it. They said, yeah, he's gay and he's one of the gang, and Chuck and Nancy are Black and they're one of the gang, and Dylan's a nerd and he's one of the gang, and Moose is a jock and he's one of the gang, and they've just sort of taken all the a lot of sort of social substrata and racial and gender substrata, and just sort of said, this is Riverdale High, which is Americana USA, and said, this is officially American now. So.
That reminds me a lot of Alison Bechtel said with regards to dykes to watch out for, with regards to diversity in the community that it's set in, which is that there are very few queer communities that are as diverse as the one dykes to watch out for, but she was creating that community whole cloth, so why wouldn't you make it as diverse as you wanted it to be and to see? Like I think what I want to see is more people who invert that question, and instead of asking why are there, you know, why is this team, you know, so demographically scattered, start asking more of others, you know, why isn't it? With fiction, you get to create that world. Why wouldn't you?
It can be aspirational. It doesn't have to be, yeah.
I was just at this screening for the 10th anniversary of the Lost pilot, and they showed one of the last episodes of the first season, and I had forgotten, because when it started I wasn't doing this kind of work, and I had forgotten how diverse that cast is. They look like the world, you know, and every character has their own backstory, and they bring their journey to like the present adventure. And I can't even think of like a better example of that kind of thing in a sort of a genre fiction context, you know. I mean, I can't now that I'm thinking about it, I can't remember if there were any queer characters on Lost, but there are people from lots of different countries, lots of different ethnicities and stuff like that, like thrown into this thing, and it was great. It was great to see a whole auditorium of people, like it's where they had the Oscars, is where this thing happened, just full of people loving it, cheering for every character they saw. It's like it made me kind of think, like, if you build it, they will come, like that kind of thing.
That's something that's come up with this show, actually, specifically. I got to go to the Carol Corps event last night, which was really great. I got to sneak in because I was covering it. And I had a conversation with Christina Rogers, who's one of the people who organized it, and who's high, I don't remember exactly what her title was, but she's really heavily involved in Emerald City, and she's in upper levels of management of it. And and I've talked to her before, and one of the things that's come up repeatedly is that Emerald City tries to basically program toward the audience they want to have. They put together events, and they throw together things like the Carol Corps event, not based on, you know, what did the people who come last year like, but you know, and deliberately go out of their way to create spaces where, you know, for diversity, which is huge. Another example, how many of you guys were in the last panel? Okay, I'm gonna retread really fast, because they're, Naughty Dog Studios is one of my, and The Last of Us is one of my favorite examples of basically using, amassing power and then using it for good. Because they put out The Last of Us, which is an awesome game. It's a AAA game. It has, the main character is visually like generic, slight, like 2-day stubble, short graying hair, brown jacket, middle-aged dude. And the other protagonist is a teenage girl. And I edited the comic, when I was at Dark Horse, I edited the comics, The Last of Us comics, and Naughty Dog said explicitly that they wanted to tell the kind of story that people who bought the game wouldn't necessarily seek out individually.
Wow.
Both to get that story out there, and because they thought it would be pretty cool to new chance and a new way to see something that it's, you know, it's the idea that it's not only it's not baiting and switching the audience, it's giving them this gift of a perspective that they wouldn't necessarily stumble over without that affiliation. And that definitely, I mean, that the result was that, and they also, so the comic is a teenage, it's like an intense teenage girl friendship coming of age story about these two teenage girls. And I'm going to spoil the DLC right now. So it's been out for 2 months. It's very short. I feel okay about doing this. If you don't want DLC spoiled, cover your
La la
ears.
la la.
And the DLC, which is about, you know, these two girls, Ellie, who's from the original game, and Riley, who's introduced from the comic, they're romantically involved in it. And this game that started out, you know, looking like every other AAA game gave us an interracial lesbian teenage couple as central characters and as point of view characters. And that using that avenue is, I think is really cool, and it's really smart. And I'm going to say, so Twitter is not working for me, and I can't load it. Now, yeah, this is, now it is. Okay, all right, so let's see. Going back there. Someone asked about the authors who described who wrote the article about stereotyping on children's cartoons. Meredith Lee Bolmer and Mark LaPont. I'll be at table 310 around all weekend. Come find me and I'll write those down. They're not spelled the way you'd expect them to be necessarily. So here I think is a great question. What are good practices for privileged authors who want to include diversity in their work? Men writing women, cisgender authors writing transgender characters, etc.
Have women friends.
Yeah. Ask people to read your work, and more than one person, like more than one woman, more than one whatever. Like,
That's such a difficult question, because it's just like you don't want, and I was talking to Ross Campbell, who's an amazing creator, about this, and how I love Ross because he has women of all different backgrounds in his work, and he's friends with women of all different backgrounds. So it's not like he's just like, I'm going to study you like a zoo animal so I can find out how I write black women. I've never felt that way about Ross. So I don't want to just say, well, go out and find some black women. That's not, they're not supposed to do your job for you by existing. So but it's always great, the wider your world is, the wider your writing is going to be.
I just want to give an example of, asking other people. So the lead writer for Guild Wars 2 was kind of puzzling over some dialogue that one of his narrative designers was writing about. It was kind of like the point in the plot where these two women kind of get together, and he was like, he asked a lot of people's opinions, but he also came to me and said, hey, Regina, does this seem authentic? Would you strike anything out? Is it too cheesy? Whatever. And I just gave him my feedback, not thinking that he would actually listen to me. But he did strike out the part that I said was a little bit too cheesy. But it's like, have other people review your work, and not just one queer person, or if that's what you're writing, but more than one.
I think also one has to be a little bit psychologically diligent about the difference between, and this is also from this very interesting Twitter conversation from yesterday, being an ally and being a savior. You shouldn't be putting your own idea of what success or goodness or whatever looks like for this group into the mouths of those characters. In other words, you're sort of recycling your own idea of how the ending should be, what the end game should be for this particular character. You're just kind of dressing it up. And I encountered this a lot. I mean, I oftentimes in the course of my comics career would get stuff from people that was like, can you look over this thing set in Morocco and make sure the headscarf looks right, because we don't want to offend anybody. And I go through and I'm like, yeah, the headscarf's fine, but she's like drinking and she's hooking up with the white guy who's going to save her and take her back to America. So it's sort of like asking, like, when I extend my middle finger, is this the correct angle? Should it be more of like a 30 or more of a 45? Because I want to get it just right. You know, it's a lot of the times there's, and I think people do this subconsciously too. You go with your own default narrative, and the sensitivity is like, well, would her hair be like this? Would she have this friend? Would she go to this restaurant? But at the end of the day, you know, like, she gets saved by the white dude or whatever. You know, like, at some point, there's always a savior white dude who enters the picture. So I think it's, you know, an ally listens not just to an ally doesn't miss the forest for the trees. It's not like, I know what the forest looks like, I just wanted, you know, to know what kind of trees are here. You sort of, you know, it's listening. I mean, because the answers will probably challenge your perspective on the world. It's not just about, I think, changing your image of what somebody else's identity is. It's letting your own identity be fluid. You know, it's allowing that entrance of someone else's perspective into your life, and that requires changing yourself. And that, I think, is the tough part.
It requires, this, I don't mean to sound flippant, but it requires living, like having experiences and learning about people and getting to know people, especially in these jobs that we're talking about, media and fiction and film and gaming and whatever. Like, so much of our media, at least in America, is just sort of like endlessly reblogging things, you know, that we already understand. And there's no like point of view anymore, you know? This is like a bigger conversation about the geek culture, I think, but you really have to like...
We should do a comics journalism panel next year.
I don't want to do it. So yeah, I mean, that's how you write those characters. That's how you address those topics. Is you have to like have a point of, this is what she said. Change yourself, and you do that by going out and having a life, you know, beyond what your understanding is of life at this moment.
Well, just as the other side of that coin is, I feel like, for me, when I have been asked a question in that vein, and is this offensive? What do you think? You know, it's very easy for umbrage to be the default reaction, and that may be your emotional reaction. That's a sincere emotional reaction. But I also think, for me at least, my brain goes to the better good here, right? Like, is this person going to get more out of me saying, well, or are they going to get more out of me saying, actually, here's why. I feel like I do feel a certain sense of responsibility to like educate or be helpful rather than potentially have my own emotional reaction to it, which may be offended.
That's so nice of you, because I can't. It's just so frustrating, because it's like, well, you're in the position that there are so many black women who it would be great to see them in the position. So it's like you're in kind of this position, this paternal position of representing us because we don't get to represent ourselves because we're not hired. So it's like, I'm already frustrated. So like, if you're coming to me for advice on whether it's offensive or not, well, it's like, well, maybe if one of us was there, you know,
I think that's valid too, though, to say, you know, here's how I would have done that, or you need to elbow you. That's, I say this as a straight male who appears white, and so I sneak by a lot of that, I think. So.
Something else to do is to, I mean, and this is going to sound weird, I'm not saying people shouldn't write characters who aren't like them, but question whether it's your story to tell, and question whether there's someone who has more claim to it who's already telling that story, and give them the platform you've got. Because the truth is, if you're a white dude in comics, odds are really good that people are going to listen when you talk about racism or sexism more than they're going to listen when a black woman does, because they might not, they don't see you as engaged in it, which is ridiculous in itself. But what it means is that you have the privilege and platform to pass on to someone else, and that's, I think, incredibly important. Something that started happening a couple of years ago, there are a couple men in the comics industry. I know there's one, Spurrier is one of them, who, if they are on a panel that's not gender balanced, will find women who are similarly qualified and just not be on the panel and switch out with them. And we need more of that. We need more more people who are taking that into their own hands, and we need more, because I think that's what large organizations and people who have the power to make those changes at an institutional level are going to see. It's really going to speak directly to that.
I think mentoring also helps. You don't have to have a mentor that looks exactly like yours, that is cut from the same cloth. And I think what we're seeing a lot is these men who are actually mentoring young men of color or women, so you'll see that change there as well, which really, really helps.
There are a couple more questions that we're not going to have time to get to. We're about out of time. But if you keep tweeting questions to me, we have a Tumblr collectively, and if you're on this panel and you're not on the Tumblr, you're not in on the Tumblr and you want to be, let me know. Where we've basically extended the conversation and keep it going. This is a topic that is way too big for one panel, and it's way bigger than an hour, and it's way, way bigger than 7 people. And so what our idea was last year is to make it an endless panel, where we try to keep the conversation going, we try to get looking past the target audience at as many places as possible, but where there's also a place where we can, ask and respond and discuss outside of conventions. And that's thatonepanel.tumblr.com.
A long ways.
Yeah, it's that one panel. ONE. It's spelled out. And we'll try to address those. Really quickly, one thing I want to add: someone mentioned that they'd really love to see someone who's involved in fat activism on another iteration of this panel. I 100% agree. Come talk to me. Let's make this happen. That would be great.
Sweet.
And in general, actually, part of the great thing about this panel is that we have our turning and shifting lineup, and it would be awesome if we could keep having a panel that's as widely representative, but changes every time.
Yeah.
Because, we speak for a lot of different perspectives, but there are infinitely more we don't. With that, I think we are,
that's it.
we're pretty much out of time. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you
for
so much
Thank
for
you.
coming. No, clapping for you. Clapping for you.